with scissors poised to cut off her waist-length hair, the final sacrifice a desperate widow would make to feed her starving children. Eleanor Hayes felt hot tears of shame streak down her hollow cheeks. The tall cowboy who stepped forward didn't offer her mere coins for her golden locks, but something she'd stopped believing in, a future where her family could thrive, not just survive. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter of 1873 had been merciless on the town of Whisper Creek. 3 months of bitter cold had frozen the ground solid, killed livestock, and left behind hollow-eyed children who'd forgotten the taste of anything but watery soup. But no one felt winter's cruelty more than Eleanor Hayes. The fever had taken James in early December, leaving her alone with 3 small children and a homestead buried in debt. Eleanor stood before her cracked mirror, fingers trembling as they wound through her hair. It fell past her waist in waves the color of wheat honey, the only beauty she had left in a life that had stripped everything else away, a luxury she could no longer afford. She twisted it into a thick rope over her shoulder and stared at her reflection. Gaunt cheeks, shadowed eyes, the ghost of the woman James had called his songbird. "Mama?" Lily's small voice came from the doorway, her 5-year-old frame draped in a dress 2 sizes too large. "Is there anything to eat today?" Eleanor forced her lips into what she hoped resembled a smile. "Soon, little one. I'm going to town. Will you bring back bread?" Hope flickered across Lily's face, and it nearly broke Eleanor's heart. "I'll try," she whispered, knowing promises were luxuries she couldn't afford either. She kissed each of her sleeping children, Lily, 3-year-old William, and baby Sarah, just 8 months old and growing thinner by the day. Sarah had stopped crying for milk 2 days ago, and the silence terrified Eleanor more than the wailing ever had. The scissors felt heavy in her pocket as she stepped into the brittle morning air. 4 miles to town, each step a prayer. "Please let him Abernathy agree. Please let it be enough." The winter sun hung pale and distant in the sky as Eleanor trudged through the snow. Her husband's old boots, stuffed with rags to fill the space, crunched through the frozen crust with each step. The threadbare shawl did little against the wind that cut through to her bones, but the cold was a blessing in its way. It numbed the hunger that had been her constant companion these past weeks. Whisper Creek came into view as the church bells tolled 11, a modest cluster of wooden buildings with smoke curling from chimneys, promising warmth she couldn't afford to envy. She passed the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, each step slower than the last as she approached Abernathy's Mercantile. The bell above the door announced her entry. The store was warm, the air heavy with the scent of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Eleanor's stomach clenched painfully. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten more than the children's leftover scraps. "Mrs. Hayes." Mr. Abernathy nodded from behind the counter, his expression a careful mask of politeness that couldn't quite hide his pity. "What brings you to town today?" Eleanor clutched her shawl tighter. "I need food, Mr. Abernathy, for the children." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, but your account, I know we've reached our limit." She swallowed hard. "I've come to make a trade." She pulled the scissors from her pocket and laid them on the counter, the metal glinting in the lamplight. Then, with hands that barely shook, she unwound her shawl and released her hair from its pins. It tumbled down her back in a golden cascade. "My hair," she said quietly. "I understand ladies' hair sells well for wigs back east." The storekeeper's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hayes, I don't, please," she whispered, the words scraping her throat. "It's all I have left to give." The bell over the door chimed again, but Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the storekeeper's face. She wouldn't turn to see another neighbor's pitying glance, another witness to her desperation. "How much for a sack of flour and some salt pork?" A deep voice rolled through the store, rich as summer thunder. Eleanor stiffened but didn't turn. Heavy footsteps approached the counter. "$5 for the flour, 3 for the pork," Abernathy replied, his eyes still locked on Eleanor's hair. "And some beans and coffee too, Miss Blackwood." "Add whatever the lady needs to my purchase," the deep voice continued. Now Eleanor turned. The man was tall, broad shoulders nearly filling the space between counter displays. His face was weathered by sun and wind, deep lines carving wisdom around eyes the color of a storm-washed sky. A stranger. Black Stetson and worn leather duster marked him as a cattleman or perhaps a drifter. His beard was flecked with silver, but there was nothing frail about the way he stood, planted like an oak that had weathered 100 seasons and expected to see 100 more. "I don't take charity, sir," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than she felt. The man Blackwood considered her with those storm-gray eyes. "Never offered any, ma'am." "Then what exactly are you offering?" His gaze traveled to the scissors on the counter, then to her hair, something unreadable crossing his face. "A fair trade. For what?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "Got a ranch 5 miles west. Need someone to cook and keep house while my usual help recovers from a broken leg." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the scissors. "I have 3 children, Mr. Blackwood. I've got the space." He shrugged as if adding 4 more souls to his household was nothing more consequential than commenting on the weather. "And enough milk cows for the little one." Miss Abernathy cleared his throat. "John Blackwood runs the largest spread this side of the territory. Mrs. Hayes bought the old Morgan place 2 years back." Eleanor had heard whispers of the reclusive rancher who'd transformed the failing Morgan Ranch into a prosperous operation, but their paths had never crossed. James had been too proud to seek work beyond their own struggling homestead. "Why would you help us?" she asked, suspicion threading through her hunger. Blackwood's expression didn't change. "I need a housekeeper. You need food. Simple math, far as I'm concerned. And my children? Children belong with their mother. His voice softened just enough to suggest there was a heart beating somewhere beneath that weathered exterior. And I've got a cook who makes enough biscuits to feed an army. Eleanor's fingers loosened around the scissors. The offer felt like a miracle, and she'd stopped believing in those the day they'd put James in the ground. But the children's hollow cheeks and Sarah's silence haunted her. When would you need me to start? Today. Got my wagon outside. She hesitated, the scissors still cold in her palm. And you won't. She couldn't finish the question, but something in his eyes changed. Mrs. Hayes, he said, voice low and firm as bedrock, I'm offering work and shelter, nothing more. You and your children will have your own quarters, food on the table, fair wages. Miss Abernathy spoke up. John's a good man, Eleanor. Known him since he came to these parts. Eleanor looked down at the scissors, then back at the rancher's weathered face. She thought of the empty cupboards at home, of Lily's question about bread, of baby Sarah's ominous silence. I need to collect my children and our things. Blackwood nodded. I'll drive you there now. Abernathy put together provisions for Mrs. Hayes' family. I'll settle the bill. As the storekeeper moved to gather supplies, Eleanor carefully set the scissors back in her pocket. Her hair remained loose around her shoulders, a silent testimony to how close she'd come to desperation's edge. You won't need to cut it, Blackwood said quietly, his eyes momentarily resting on the golden waves before returning to her face. Not for food, anyway. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but the first breath after nearly drowning. Thank you, she whispered. His only response was a slight nod before he turned to help Abernathy load supplies. Outside, the winter sun had emerged from behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. Eleanor stood on the mercantile's porch, watching as Blackwood loaded packages into a sturdy wagon. The cold still bit through her thin dress, and uncertainty still stretched before her like the endless prairie. But for the first time since they'd lowered James into the frozen ground, Eleanor felt something stir inside her that she'd thought was dead and buried with him. Hope, small and fragile as a winter sparrow, but alive all the same. Ready, Mrs. Hayes? Blackwood held out a hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Eleanor took it, her small fingers disappearing into his calloused palm. My children will have full bellies by nightfall, he finished for her. That's a promise I intend to keep. As the wagon pulled away from the mercantile, Eleanor felt the weight of the scissors in her pocket, a reminder of what she'd been prepared to sacrifice. She touched her hair, still intact, and wondered what other sacrifices might lie ahead. But for now, for today, her children would eat, and that was enough to carry her forward into whatever waited at the Blackwood ranch. The wagon creaked and swayed along the rutted road back to Eleanor's cabin. Blackwood handled the reins with quiet competence, his presence beside her solid as a mountain. He didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary talk, and Eleanor was grateful. She needed these moments to gather her thoughts, to prepare herself for whatever lay ahead. It's just around this bend, she said as they approached the small clearing where James had built their home 3 summers ago. The cabin looked smaller somehow, more fragile against the vast white prairie stretching behind it. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney. Lily must have managed to keep the fire going as instructed. Blackwood pulled the wagon to a stop and surveyed the homestead with an appraising eye. Good timber work, he commented. Your husband built it? Yes. The single word carried the weight of memories. James with an axe over his shoulder. His laughter as he'd promised her a palace and delivered this humble shelter instead. She'd never minded. It had been enough. I'll wait here while you gather your things and the children. He reached beneath the seat and pulled out a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Might want to give them something to eat first. Journey's easier on a full stomach. Inside the package were thick slices of bread, cheese, and apples. Simple food that might as well have been a feast. Eleanor clutched it to her chest. Thank you. The door flew open before she reached it. Lily stood there, eyes wide. Mama! You're back! Her gaze darted to the wagon, curiosity and wariness battling across her small face. Who's that man? Blackwood, Eleanor said, ushering her daughter inside. He's offered Mama work at his ranch. We'll be staying there for a while. She knelt down, meeting Lily's eyes. There will be food, sweetheart. Enough for all of us. Lily's face brightened, then dimmed. But what about our home? And Papa's thing? Eleanor's throat tightened. We'll lock up the cabin, keep it safe until we return. Papa's things come with us. William had awakened from his nap and stood in the doorway of the small bedroom they all shared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Mama, hungry, he mumbled, his small hand patting his concave belly. I know, my love. Look what I've brought. Eleanor unwrapped the parcel on their rough wooden table, and the children's eyes widened at the sight of the food. She checked on baby Sarah, finding her awake but unnervingly quiet in the wooden cradle James had carved. The infant's eyes followed Eleanor's movements, but she made no sound, her tiny limbs barely stirring beneath the thin blanket. Eleanor lifted her, alarmed at how light she felt. Eat slowly, she cautioned the older children as she settled Sarah in her lap and tore a small piece of bread, softening it with a few drops of water before gently placing it in the baby's mouth. We'll have more later. It took less than an hour to gather their belongings: clothes, a few books, James's pocket watch, the family Bible, and the quilt Eleanor's mother had made for her wedding day. There wasn't much else worth taking. Eleanor wrapped Sarah in every blanket they owned and instructed Lily and William to wear all their clothes, layer upon layer. Cold would be bitter on the open wagon. Blackwood helped load their meager possessions without comment. Only when Eleanor brought out James's old shotgun did his eyebrow raised slightly. Know how to use that? James taught me, she said, her chin lifting. A woman alone needs protection. He nodded. That she does. He took the weapon respectfully, checking that it was unloaded before securing it beneath the wagon seat. The children regarded the tall stranger with wide eyes. William hid behind Eleanor's skirts while Lily stood her ground, small shoulders squared as if preparing to defend her family if necessary. Are you a good man, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, her child's voice clear in the winter air. Eleanor gasped. Lily! But Blackwood crouched down to the girl's level, his weathered face solemn. I try to be, Miss Lily. Not always successful, but I do try. He held out a large hand. Will that do for now? Lily considered this with all the gravity of her 5 years, then nodded once and placed her tiny hand in his. I suppose. But if you're mean to Mama, I'll have to ask you to leave. A smile cracked through Blackwood's serious expression. That's a fair arrangement. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch took nearly 2 hours. Eleanor sat sandwiched between her daughters, with William on Blackwood's knee, the boy having decided the rancher was acceptable company after being allowed to help with the reins. Sarah slept against Eleanor's chest, bundled so thoroughly that only her small face was visible. There it is, Blackwood said as they crested a hill. Blackwood Ranch. Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. She'd expected something modest, perhaps a cabin larger than their own with a barn and corral. Instead, a proper house stood in a sheltered valley, 2 stories of solid construction with glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. A sprawling barn, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings formed a protective semicircle around a central yard. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys, and even from this distance she could see figures moving about, signs of life and activity. It's big, Lily whispered, pressing closer to Eleanor's side. Morgan built it thinking he'd fill it with children, Blackwood explained as he guided the horses down the slope. Ended up just him and his wife until they sold to me. Got more space than I need. And how many live here now? Eleanor asked, suddenly anxious about introducing her family into an established household. Besides me, there's Mrs. Gunderson. She's cook and housekeeper, but she broke her leg last month. 3 cowhands live in the bunkhouse, Miguel, Caleb, and Dawson. They keep to themselves mostly. The wagon rolled into the yard, and a tall, thin man emerged from the barn, raising a hand in greeting. That's Caleb, Blackwood said. Best horseman in 3 counties, not that he'd admit it. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see Caleb was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 20 or so. With sandy hair and a boyish face despite his height, he approached the wagon, curious eyes taking in Eleanor and the children. Found yourself some strays, boss? He asked, a friendly smile softening the words. Mrs. Hayes and her children will be staying with us while Mrs. Gunderson heals, Blackwood replied, setting the brake. Mrs. Hayes, this is Caleb Tucker. Ma'am. Caleb tipped his hat. Young'un. William stared at the young cowhand with undisguised fascination, especially his worn leather chaps and the pistol strapped to his hip. Are you a real cowboy? He asked, voice hushed with awe. Sure am, partner, Caleb replied. Maybe if your ma permits, I can show you the horses later. William's eyes grew round as saucers. Can I, Mama, please? We'll see, Eleanor said, unwilling to make promises in this new and uncertain situation. Blackwood lifted William down, then offered his hand to Eleanor. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his help, Sarah still cradled in her other arm. The baby had stirred awake, her eyes blinking at the unfamiliar surrounding. Mrs. Gunderson's expecting you, Blackwood said, lifting Lily down last. She's a bit prickly about being laid up, but she's a good woman. The front door opened as they approached, revealing an older woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She stood with the aid of a crutch, her right leg encased in a bulky splint from knee to ankle. Despite her obvious discomfort, her posture remained ramrod straight, and her eyes bright blue and sharp missed nothing as they swept over Eleanor and the children. So these are our guests, she said, her voice carrying the faint lilt of Scandinavia. Come in before you freeze solid. The interior of the house was warm and smelled of baking bread and pine. A wide central hallway led past a formal parlor and study to what appeared to be a large kitchen at the rear. A staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister gleaming with polish. Mrs. Gunderson, this is Mrs. Hayes and her children, Lily, William, and baby Sarah, Blackwood introduced. Mrs. Hayes will be taking over your duties until you're back on your feet. Mrs. Gunderson's eyes narrowed slightly as they took in Eleanor's thin frame. Can you cook, girl? Yes, ma'am, Eleanor replied, lifting her chin. My mother taught me, and I managed our household since I was 16. We'll see. The older woman's gaze softened slightly when it landed on the children. The little ones look half-starved. They haven't had proper meals in some time, Eleanor admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. Well, that ends today, Mrs. Gunderson declared. John, show them upstairs to the east rooms while I finish dinner. She looked pointedly at Sarah. And fetch the goat's milk from the spring house for that babe. She needs it more than the cheeses do. As Blackwood led them upstairs, Eleanor felt Lily's small hand slip into hers, squeezing tight. The child's face was a mixture of wonder and apprehension as she took in their new surrounding. It's only temporary, Eleanor whispered, as much to reassure herself as her daughter, until we can stand on our own again. Ahead of them, Blackwood paused at the top of the stairs, looking back with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see more than Eleanor was comfortable revealing. For as long as you need, he said simply, before turning to continue down the hallway. The east rooms turned out to be a connected suite, a modest sitting room with a small fireplace, a bedroom large enough for a full-sized bed and cradle, and a smaller adjoining room with 2 narrow beds clearly meant for children. The furnishings were simple but sturdy, the linens clean and smelling faintly of lavender. Large windows faced the morning sun, though now they framed the purpling twilight of approaching evening. These were meant to be family quarters, Blackwood explained, setting down the crate containing their few possessions. Never been properly used. Eleanor stood in the center of the sitting room, Sarah still in her arms, taking in surroundings finer than any she'd known since leaving her parents' home in Ohio. "It's too much," she said quietly. "We don't need so much space. House has the space to give." Blackwood replied with a shrug. No sense leaving it empty. Lily had already ventured to the window, pressing her nose against the glass. "Look, Mama, horses." Her breath fogged the pain as she pointed toward the corrals where several horses milled about in the fading light. William tugged at Blackwood's coat. "Can I see them? The horses?" "Tomorrow," Eleanor interjected before the rancher could answer. "It's nearly dark now." Blackwood nodded. "Your mama's right. Horses will still be there come morning." He moved toward the door. "Washrooms at the end of the hall. Dinner in an hour. Rest until then if you'd like." When he'd gone, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overcome by the day's events. Just this morning, she'd been preparing to sell her hair for a few days' worth of food. Now her children were housed in comfort, with the promise of regular meals and wages besides. It felt like a dream, and she half expected to wake in their cold cabin, the hunger still gnawing at their bellies. "Mama," Lily's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are we going to live here now?" Eleanor set Sarah on the bed and beckoned her older children to her side. "For a while," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Blackwood has given Mama work to do, and a place for us to stay while I do it. But our home is still our home. When spring comes and I've saved enough, we'll decide what's best." "I like it here," William declared. "It's warm." Such a simple thing, Eleanor thought, to value warmth above all else. These past months had taught her children to prioritize survival in ways no child should have to learn. A soft knock at the door revealed Mrs. Gunderson, balancing awkwardly on her crutch while holding a tray with a steaming cup and a small pitcher. "Goat's milk for the baby," she announced, nodding toward the pitcher. "And willowbark tea for you." Eleanor moved quickly to take the tray. "You shouldn't be carrying things, Mrs. Gunderson." The older woman snorted. "Been telling me what I shouldn't do since I was a girl. Hasn't worked yet." But she relinquished the tray, leaned more heavily on her crutch, betraying her discomfort. "Thank you for the milk." Eleanor carried it to where Sarah lay. The baby's eyes were open, watching the unfamiliar ceiling with solemn interest. "When did she last nurse properly?" Mrs. Gunderson asked, her eyes sharp on the infant. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My milk began to fail about 2 weeks ago. There wasn't enough food, ... Single quotes. Mrs. Gunderson's face softened almost imperceptibly. "No judgment, girl. Just need to know what we're dealing with." She watched as Eleanor gently lifted Sarah and spooned a little milk between her lips. The baby swallowed eagerly. "Feed her small amounts often. Her stomach will need time to remember its purpose." Eleanor nodded, relief flooding through her as Sarah took another spoonful without protest. "I was afraid she might." She couldn't finish the sentence with the children listening. "She rallied," Mrs. S. Gunderson stated with the confidence of one who had seen many babies thrive against the odds. "All of you will." She turned to go, then paused. "John said you'd be taking over my duties. We'll talk about that tomorrow. For tonight, just rest and eat." After she'd gone, Eleanor continued feeding Sarah tiny spoonfuls of milk while Lily and William explored their new quarters, marveling at luxuries Eleanor had once taken for granted: a rocking chair with intact slats, curtains at the windows, a colorful rag rug on the floor. By the time they went down to dinner, Sarah had consumed a promising amount of milk and fallen into a more peaceful sleep than Eleanor had seen in weeks. She settled the baby in the wooden cradle Blackwood had brought up from somewhere in the house, newer than the one James had made, but similar in design. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large, warm space dominated by a massive oak table that could easily seat 12. A black iron cook stove radiated heat from one wall, while copper pots hung in gleaming rows above a wide sink. The room smelled of fresh bread, roasting meat, and something sweet. Mrs. Gunderson presided over the stove despite her injury, waving away Eleanor's offer of help. "Not tonight. Tonight you eat." Besides Blackwood, the 3 cowhands had come in for the meal. Caleb they'd already met. Nigel was a compact man with quick, dark eyes and a ready smile. Dawson was older, perhaps 40, with a graying beard and few words. All 3 regarded the newcomers with curiosity but showed the children kindness. Miguel producing a small wooden horse from his pocket for William and Caleb, complimenting Lily's careful manners. The meal was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, carrots cooked with honey, and bread still warm from the oven. Eleanor had to remind herself to eat slowly, though her body cried out for her to devour everything in sight. She watched her children with a mixture of joy and heartache as they too struggled to maintain decorum in the face of such plenty. "Mrs. Hayes," Blackwood said from the head of the table, "I should explain your duties so you know what to expect." Eleanor set down her fork. "Of course. Mrs. Gunderson usually handles all the cooking, cleaning, mending, and general running of the house." He nodded toward the older woman. "With her leg as it is, she can manage some cooking, but not much else. I'll need you to take on the cleaning, laundry, and whatever else she directs." I can cook as well, Eleanor offered. To ease Mrs. Gunderson's burden, the housekeeper made a dismissive sound. We'll see if you meet my standards first. Blackwood's mouth twitched slightly. As for terms, room and board for you and your children, plus $20 a month. Eleanor nearly choked on her water. $20 was a small fortune, more than James had sometimes made in 2 months of hard labor. That's too generous, she protested. Blackwood regarded her steadily. It's the going rate for a housekeeper with experience. I don't offer charity, Mrs. Hayes. Just fair compensation. Pride warred with practicality in Eleanor's chest. With wages like that, she could pay off James's outstanding debts by summer and still have enough to plant a proper garden, maybe even buy a milk cow of their own. Thank you, she said finally, accepting both the position and the dignity he offered with it. I'll earn every penny. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I don't doubt that for a moment. Later, as Eleanor tucked her children into bed, softer than any they'd known in their short lives, she wondered about the enigma that was John Blackwood. He was not an easy man to read. His weathered face revealed little, and his words were measured. But she'd seen the gentle way he'd helped William onto his chair at dinner, the quiet respect he showed to everyone in his household. Whatever had brought him to this remote ranch alone, without family, it had not hardened his heart completely. Mama? Lily's voice came drowsily from her bed. Mr. Blackwood seemed sad. Children saw things adults missed, Eleanor thought. Perhaps he is, sweetheart. Like you're sad about Papa. Eleanor smoothed Lily's hair back from her forehead. Everyone carries sadness sometimes, but that doesn't mean they can't also carry kindness. I think he's nice, William mumbled, already half asleep. He said I could help with the horses. We'll see, Eleanor repeated, though she suspected Blackwood would keep his word to her son. He struck her as a man who didn't make promises lightly. After the children had drifted off, Eleanor checked on Sarah one last time before allowing herself the luxury of washing with the hot water someone likely. Mrs. Gunderson had left in a pitcher on the washstand. She slipped into her nightgown, marveling at the softness of the bed as she sank on. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the house. But here, within these solid walls, her children slept warm and full-bellied. Tomorrow would bring hard work, if she knew anything about running a household this size, but tonight, for this moment, she could breathe. Eleanor's hand drifted to her hair, still intact, falling loose around her shoulders now. Such a small thing to be grateful for when weighed against all they'd gained today. Yet as she closed her eyes, she sent up a wordless prayer of thanks for the strain. Quiet rancher who had seen her standing at the precipice of desperation and offered not a handout but a way back to solid ground. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the days after, but tonight, for the first time since James had been lowered into the frozen earth, Eleanor Hayes slept without fear, clutching at her heart. Eleanor awoke before dawn, the habits of hard necessity not easily broken even by the comfort of a real mattress. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness, reaching instinctively for children who weren't beside her. Then reality rushed back. The mercantile, Blackwood, the ranch. She slipped from the bed, her bare feet meeting the unexpected softness of a rag rug instead of cold floorboards. A quick check revealed all 3 children still sleeping soundly. Sarah's breathing seemed easier, her tiny face more relaxed than it had been in weeks. Eleanor dressed quietly in the dark, twisting her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. If she was to earn her keep in this house, she would start as she meant to go on proving her worth from the first hour. The kitchen was already warm and lit by oil lamps when she entered. Mrs. Gunderson sat at the table, a cup of coffee steaming before her, her injured leg propped on a low stool. You're up early, the older woman observed, her tone neutral. I wanted to get breakfast started, Eleanor replied, smoothing her apron. Mrs. Gunderson regarded her for a long moment, then nodded toward the stove. Biscuit flours in the blue canister, bacon's in the cold box. Men like their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Eleanor set to work, grateful for clear directions. The kitchen was well stocked and organized, a testament to Mrs. Gunderson's efficiency. As she worked, the older woman watched with sharp eyes, occasionally offering guidance but mostly observing in silence. Where did you learn to cook? Mrs. Gunderson finally asked as Eleanor deftly formed biscuit dough with practiced hands. My mother taught me the basics. After she died, I kept house for my father and brothers. Then I married James and kept house for him. Eleanor paused, flour dusting her fingers. Nothing fancy, but good. Plain food. Good. Plain food is what working men need, Mrs. Gunderson agreed. None of your fancy city restaurant nonsense. By the time heavy boots thumped on the back porch, Eleanor had breakfast well in hand. Biscuits browning in the oven, bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet, coffee percolating fragrantly, and a pot of oatmeal bubbling for the children. Mrs. Gunderson had relaxed somewhat, even allowing Eleanor to take over the final preparations without hovering instruction. Blackwood entered first, stamping snow from his boots. Cold had painted his cheeks ruddy above his beard, breath still visible in the air that rushed in with him. He paused, clearly surprised to see Eleanor already at work, but recovered quickly. Morning, Mrs. Hayes. You're up early. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. Breakfast is nearly ready. He hung his coat on a peg by the door, his eyes taking in the scene, the set table, the food cooking, the industrious widow who'd been prepared to sell her hair just yesterday. Something flickered across his face too quickly for Eleanor to interpret. The ranch hands filed in next, bringing with them the scents of horses, hay, and the crisp morning air. They greeted Eleanor with surprising politeness, even shy Dawson murmuring a morning ma'am as he took his place. Where are your young'uns? Caleb asked, reaching for the coffee Eleanor set on the table. Still sleeping, she replied. They need the rest. Children need structure, Mrs. Gunderson interjected. Regular meal times, regular bedtimes, good habits. Eleanor bristled slightly but kept her voice even. Yes, they do. They'll adjust to the household schedule once they've recovered their strength. The older woman sniffed but didn't argue further. Eleanor served the men efficiently, keeping the coffee cups filled and the biscuits coming. She'd just set the last platter on the table when soft footsteps padded in the hallway. Lily appeared in the doorway, already dressed but with sleep still evident in her drooping eyelids. She carried Sarah on her hip, the baby blinking owlishly at the bright kitchen. William's still sleeping, Mama, Lily reported, her voice small in the now quiet kitchen. She looked uncertainly at the men around the table. Eleanor went to her, taking Sarah into her arms. Good morning, sweetheart. Are you hungry? Lily nodded, her eyes darting to the loaded table. Come then. I've made oatmeal for you. She settled Lily at the far end of the table and placed Sarah in her lap so she could serve the little girl. Mrs. Hayes, Blackwood's voice drew her attention. Your place is at the table with your children. The men can serve themselves. Eleanor hesitated. In her experience, the woman of the house ate after the men had been served, often taking her meal standing while tending to other tasks. That's how it's done here, Mrs. Gunderson confirmed, though something in her tone suggested this was Blackwood's rule rather than long-standing custom. Thank you, Eleanor said, sitting beside Lily and adjusting Sarah in her arms. The baby seemed more alert this morning, her eyes tracking movement around the room with greater interest. Blackwood's gaze lingered on the infant. She's looking better already, the goat's milk agreed with her. Eleanor replied, preparing to feed Sarah another spoonful. To her surprise, Blackwood rose and came around the table, holding out his hand. May I? You should eat while it's hot. Before Eleanor could recover from her astonishment, he had gently taken Sarah from her arms. The baby regarded him with solemn curiosity as he settled back in his chair, cradling her with surprising expertise. More surprising still was the way Sarah reached up to pat his bearded jaw, something like a smile ghosting across her tiny face. You have children, Mr. Blackwood? Eleanor asked before she could think better of it. A shadow passed behind his eyes. Had a daughter once. The simple past tense spoke volume. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but knew better than to press on what was clearly a painful subject. She likes you, she said instead, nodding towards Sarah, who was now contentedly grasping Blackwood's index finger in her small fist. Babies are good judges of character, Mrs. Gunderson observed dryly. Better than most adults, after breakfast. While the men returned to their outdoor duties, Eleanor set about her new responsibilities with determination. There was laundry to be done, floors to be scrubbed, dusting and polishing, and a dozen other tasks that had clearly been neglected during Mrs. Gunderson's convalescence. William finally woke mid-morning, rushing into the kitchen with the unbridled energy only a well-rested 3-year-old could muster. Mama, where's the horses? Outside in the barn, young man, where horses belong, Mrs. Gunderson answered before Eleanor could. And it's where are the horses, not where's. William looked momentarily crestfallen at the correction until the older woman softened and added, Your mama's busy with the washing. If you'll sit here nicely and eat your breakfast. Perhaps after I'll tell you about the horses until someone can take you to see them proper. To Eleanor's surprise, the stern housekeeper produced a small wooden box from a shelf and set it before William as he ate his belated breakfast. Inside were carved animals, horses, cows, and other barnyard creatures, worn smooth with age and handling. My boys played with these long ago, Mrs. S. Gunderson said, a rare softness in her voice. They're just gathering dust now. By midday, Eleanor had made considerable progress on the most pressing chores. Lily had appointed herself baby minder, watching over Sarah in a corner of the kitchen while Eleanor worked. The little girl sang softly to her sister, old lullabies Eleanor had taught her, her childish voice sweet and clear in the quiet house. William had eventually been escorted to see the horses by Caleb, who had appeared at the kitchen door with the stated purpose of getting more coffee but a transparent interest in rescuing the fidgety boy from confinement. Mrs. Gunderson had given permission with surprising readiness, only instructing the young ranch hand to keep him from under the hooves. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line stretched across the back porch, taking advantage of the brief sunshine despite the cold. When Blackwood returned from whatever ranch business had occupied his morning, You've been busy, he observed, noting the freshly scrubbed porch and the billowing sheets. Trying to earn my keep, she replied, securing a pillowcase with wooden pins. He frowned slightly. You're not a servant, Mrs. Hayes. I'm your employee, she corrected. And I take pride in doing a job well. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. Fair enough. He hesitated, then added, I'm riding into town this afternoon. Is there anything you need for yourself or the children? Eleanor's hands stilled on the laundry. There were 100 things her family needed. Clothes that fit, shoes without holes, proper winter coats, but pride locked the words in her throat. We're fine for now, thank you. Blackwood studied her face, clearly reading the struggle there. Mrs. Gunderson mentioned the children could use warmer clothes. I thought perhaps you could make a list of necessities, to be deducted from your wages, of course. The compromise allowed Eleanor to maintain her dignity while addressing their needs. That would be, thank you. He nodded once, then turned to go. Mr. Blackwood? She called after him. He paused, looking back. William hasn't stopped talking about the horses since Caleb brought him in. Thank you for allowing him that joy. A rare smile softened Blackwood's weathered features. Boy needs something to light him up after a hard winter. Horses have a way of doing that. As he walked away, Eleanor wondered again about the daughter he'd mentioned so briefly. Had she loved horses too? Had she had her father's storm gray eyes, his quiet strength? The questions lingered as Eleanor returned to her work. The rhythm of domestic tasks, familiar and comforting after months of desperate scrambling merely to survive. Whatever sorrows John Blackwood carried, he'd chosen to extend kindness to her family in their darkest hour. For that alone, she owed him respect and her best efforts. The rest, the mysteries, the shadows behind his eyes, the rare glimpses of gentleness, those weren't hers to unravel, at least not yet. Blackwood returned from town as the winter sun was beginning its early descent. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as he unloaded packages from the wagon, more than she'd expected for the simple necessities she'd listed. She'd been sparing in her requests: swarm stockings for the children, wool for new mittens, thread for mending, basic needs, nothing more. She dried her hands on her apron and went to meet him, tending to help carry things inside. No need, he said when she reached the porch steps. I'll bring it all in. He hefted several packages, leaving the largest ones in the wagon for a second trip. You bought more than what I listed, she observed, holding the door as he carried the parcels inside. Winter's not done with us yet, he replied simply. Children need proper gear. In the warmth of the kitchen, he set the packages on the table. Mrs. Gunderson had gone to rest after lunch, leaving Eleanor in charge of dinner preparations. The savory scent of beef stew simmering on the stove filled the air, along with the yeasty promise of rising bread dough. Smells good in here, Blackwood commented, removing his hat and coat. Thank you. Eleanor eyed the packages, her practical mind already calculating the cost against her promised wages. Mr. Blackwood, about the expense. We'll settle accounts at the end of the month, he interrupted, not unkind. No sense counting pennies before they're spent. Before Eleanor could respond, the door to the sitting room opened and William burst in, followed more sedately by Lily carrying Sarah. The children had been playing quietly while Eleanor worked, unusually well behaved after their morning explorations had tired them out. Mr. Blackwood, William exclaimed, his earlier shyness entirely forgotten. Did you see my horse friend? Caleb showed me the brown one with the white face. That would be Domino, Blackwood replied, crouching to the boy's level. And yes, I saw him. He asked why you weren't out visiting this afternoon. William's eyes widened. He did? Really? Horses have a way of knowing when someone appreciates them. Blackwood's expression softened, the lines around his eyes crinkling. I brought something back from town you might like. He reached for one of the smaller packages and unwrapped it, revealing a carved wooden horse, far finer than the simple toys Mrs. Gunderson had shared earlier. The figurine was detailed enough to show muscles and flowing mane, painted a rich chestnut with a white blaze down its face. Looks just like Domino, doesn't it? Blackwood held it out to William, whose small hands reached for it with reverent care. For me? The boy whispered. For you. Every cowboy needs his own horse, even if it's a small one for now. Single quotes. William clutched the toy to his chest, his face alight with joy beyond his years. Thank you, sir. Blackwood turned to Lily, who watched the exchange with quiet interest. Sarah balanced on her hip. I didn't forget you, Miss Lily, from another package. He produced a small cloth doll with yarn hair the same honey-wheat color as Lily's own. The doll wore a calico dress and tiny leather boots, her painted face bearing a gentle smile. Oh, Lily breathed, clearly torn between reaching for the gift and maintaining her hold on her baby sister. Eleanor stepped forward to take Sarah, allowing Lily to accept the doll with both hands. She's beautiful, the little girl said, running a finger over the doll's yarn hair. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You're a good big sister, he said, his voice gentle. I thought you deserved something that was just for you. The simple acknowledgement of Lily's constant, uncomplaining care for her siblings brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. How many times had her eldest sacrificed without complaint, giving up her portion at meals or entertaining the younger children while Eleanor worked? The doll was a small thing, but the recognition behind it spoke volumes. And for the little one, Blackwood continued, oblivious to Eleanor's emotion as he unwrapped a soft-knitted blanket in pale yellow, something warmer than those thin things she's been wrapped in. Eleanor blinked back tears. Mr. Blackwood, this is too much. Necessary, not excessive, he corrected, turning to retrieve more packages from outside. The rest is practical. Coats, boots, warm clothes. When he'd brought everything in, the table was covered with parcels. Besides the toys and baby blanket, Blackwood had purchased sensible winter clothing for all three children, a warm shawl for Eleanor that she tried unsuccessfully to refuse, and even a set of books readers for Lily, picture books for William, and a volume of children's tales Eleanor might read aloud in the evening. Been more than generous, Eleanor said when the children had taken their treasures to the sitting room, leaving the adults alone in the kitchen. Blackwood stood by the stove, warming his hands after the outdoor cold. It's not generosity to provide proper tools for the job, Mrs. Hayes. Children can't thrive without the basics. Even so, you didn't have to. I've been where you are. His interruption was quiet but firm after my Elizabeth died. There were years when I wouldn't have survived without help. It was the first personal information he'd volunteered, and Eleanor found herself hungover. Your wife? He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames visible through the stove's grate. Childbirth fever took her and our daughter both. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly, understanding now the shadow that had crossed his face when he'd mentioned having a daughter. Long time ago now. His voice was even controlled, but Eleanor heard the grief beneath it. Not raw anymore, but worn smooth like a river stone, always there beneath the surface. She turned to check the stew, giving him a moment to compose himself. How long have you had this ranch? Bought it 2 years back after selling my place in Colorado. He seemed relieved at the change of subject. Morgan was keen to move east. His wife never did take to frontier life. It's a fine property, Eleanor commented. You've done well with it. Hard work and good hands make all the difference. Blackwood glanced toward the door. Speaking of which, I should check that the men have finished mending that north fence. Storm's coming tonight. After he'd gone, Eleanor stood for a long moment looking at the packages scattered across the table. Such simple things. Clothes, books, toys, yet they represented a normalcy her children had been without for too long. The past months had been about survival, nothing more. Now suddenly, there was room for small joys again. When Mrs. Gunderson returned from her rest, she surveyed the bounty with raised eyebrows. John's been generous. Too generous, Eleanor agreed, folding a small coat. I told him it was excessive. The older woman snorted softly. Man's got his reasons, I expect. He mentioned his wife and daughter, Eleanor said carefully, that they died in childbirth. Mrs. Gunderson's hands stilled on her crutch. Did he now? He doesn't speak of them often. She lowered herself into a chair with a wince. Elizabeth was a fine woman, gentle soul. The fever took her fast before the doctor could even reach them. How old was Miss Blackwood when it happened? Young, not yet 30. The daughter, they'd planned to name her Margaret. She never drew breath. Mrs. Gunderson's voice softened with old sorrow. Nearly destroyed him. He sold everything. Disappeared for years, riding from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work came his way. Some men drown grief in whiskey. John drowned his in labor. Eleanor thought of the controlled strength in Blackwood's hands, the careful way he'd held Sarah that morning. A man who'd lost everything, who'd rebuilt himself through sheer force of will. When did he come back, she asked. 2 years ago, as he said. Showed up with enough money to buy the Morgan place outright. Hired good men, worked from dawn to dusk. Doesn't speak much about those years in between. Mrs. Gunderson fixed Eleanor with a shrewd look. Not my place to tell more, even if I knew it. The housekeeper clearly considered the conversation finished, turning her attention to dinner preparations. Eleanor didn't press further, though questions lingered. Instead, she helped Lily try on her new coat, adjusted William's 2 large boots, and marveled at how Sarah's thin face already seemed less pinched after just 1 day of proper feeding. That night, after the children were settled in their new clothes and tucked beneath warm blankets, Eleanor sat by the small fireplace in their sitting room, a mending basket at her feet. Though the ranch house was larger and more comfortable than any home she'd known as an adult, she found herself thinking of the small cabin she and James had built. It wasn't grand, but it had been theirs, filled with hopes and plans for a future that now would never come. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Blackwood standing in the hallway, a book in his hand. Thought you might want this, he said, holding it out. Found it when I was clearing out the study. Poetry, Wordsworth, Keats, those fellows. Noticed you looking at the books in the parlor earlier. Eleanor accepted it, surprised and touched that he'd noticed such a small thing. Thank you. I do enjoy poetry. When there's time for reading, everyone needs something that feeds more than just the body. His eyes, usually so guarded, met hers directly. Good night, Mrs. Hayes. Good night, Mr. Blackwood, and thank you for everything. After he'd gone, Eleanor opened the book, breathing in the familiar scent of paper and ink. On the flyleaf, written in delicate feminine script, was a name, Elizabeth Blackwood. Eleanor traced the letters gently, feeling the weight of trust implied in the loan. Not just any book, but his wife's book. Outside, the promised storm began, wind rattling the window pane. But inside, surrounded by her sleeping children and holding this unexpected gift, Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire still burning low in the grate. Days slipped into a week, then 2. January yielded grudgingly to February, the weather growing no less harsh. But life at Blackwood Ranch settled into rhythms that brought comfort through their predictability. Eleanor rose before dawn, prepared breakfast with Mrs. S. Gunderson, whose initial frostiness had thawed to grudging respect, and managed the household with growing confidence. The children thrived under the routine of regular meals and warm shelter, their hollow cheeks filling out, their eyes brightening with the resilience of youth. Sarah especially showed remarkable improvement. The listless, silent infant had transformed into an alert, babbling baby who reached for faces and objects with newfound energy. She'd begun to sleep through the night, much to Eleanor's relief, and had mastered the art of charming everyone in the household, particularly Blackwood, who Eleanor often found cradling the infant while reviewing ledgers in the evening. Sarah's tiny hand wrapped around his finger as if to anchor him in place. This morning, a rare break in the winter storms had brought sunshine streaming through the kitchen kitchen windows. Eleanor kneaded bread dough with practiced hands, enjoying the familiar resistance beneath her palm. Mrs. Gunderson sat nearby, her splinted leg propped on a stool as she sorted dried herbs for the evening stew. "Your daughter favors you," the housekeeper commented, nodding toward Sarah, who sat in a cushioned basket on the table, watching the women work with solemn interest. "Everyone says so," Eleanor agreed, folding the dough over itself, though William is his father's image. "Good man, was he?" "Your husband?" Eleanor's hand stilled momentarily. "James was dedicated, hardworking. He had dreams of making something of our homestead." Mrs. Gunderson's piercing blue eyes studied Eleanor's face. "That's not what I asked." Eleanor resumed kneading, considering her answer carefully. "He was a good man in many ways, quick to anger sometimes, especially when things went wrong, stubborn to a fault." She paused. "He loved the children, though he didn't always know how to show it." "Men rarely do," Mrs. Gunderson said dryly. "My Sven was the same. Good provider, poor talker." "How long were you married?" 32 years, until the consumption took him." A shadow of old grief crossed the older woman's face. "Raised 3 boys together. All gone east now with families of their own. They write, but single quote," she shrugged. "Life carries people in different directions. Do you miss them?" Eleanor asked softly. "Every day." Mrs. Gunderson's weathered hands stilled on the herbs. "But I wouldn't have them back in this wilderness. They have better lives there. My eldest a doctor, middle one a teacher, youngest works for the railroad. They've made something of themselves." Pride rang clear in her voice, and Eleanor understood suddenly why the stern housekeeper had chosen to remain in this remote territory rather than join her sons back east. To her, their success was the culmination of her life's work, a mother's ultimate achievement. "You've done well by them," Eleanor said. Mrs. Gunderson nodded once, accepting the truth of this without false modesty. "And you'll do right by yours. Now you've got proper footing again." The back door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and the sound of boots on wooden planks. Blackwood entered, followed by William, both ruddy-cheeked from the cold. The boy clutched his wooden horse in one mittened hand, chattering excitedly. "And Caleb said I can help brush Domino tomorrow if it's not too cold, and maybe even feed him an apple. But I have to hold it flat on my hand so his teeth don't get me by accident, because horses don't mean to bite, but sometimes they can't tell fingers from apples." "Sounds like you've had quite the morning," Eleanor interrupted, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. His transformation from the listless, hungry child of a month ago never failed to amaze her. "Mr. Black would show me how the horses wear blankets when it's cold, just like people," William announced, shedding his coat and rushing to show his toy horse to Sarah, who batted at it with delighted gurgles. "He's got a good eye for horse flesh," Blackwood commented, hanging his coat by the door. "Spotted a limp and stargazer before even Miguel noticed it." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at the compliment. "His father had a way with animals too." Blackwood nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "Wondering if you might help me with something this afternoon, Mrs. Hayes." "Of course. Been going through some old storage trunks in the attic. Found some things that might be useful for the children, but I'm not sure what's appropriate for their ages." He seemed almost awkward in the asking. "Thought you might have a look. Tell me what could be put to use and what should be stored away." Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Mars Gunderson, whose expression remained neutral but whose eyes held a flicker of interest. "I'd be happy to." After lunch, with the bread rising by the stove and the children settled for quiet time with Lily reading to her siblings from one of the new books, Eleanor followed Blackwood up a narrow staircase to the attic. The space was surprisingly neat and dry, with trunks and crates arranged in orderly rows beneath the pitched roof. "Most of this came with the house," Blackwood explained, lighting a lamp against the dimness. "Morgan left in a hurry, didn't take much besides personal items. Said the rest wasn't worth the shipping." He led her to a section where several trunks stood with their lids open. Inside the first, Eleanor could see children's clothing quality pieces, carefully packed away. "Morgan had 2 daughters, I believe," Blackwood continued. "Grown by the time I bought the place. Thought some of these things might fit your Lily. Maybe be altered for the boy." Eleanor knelt beside the trunk, running her fingers over fine cotton and wool. The clothes were old-fashioned but well-made, many barely worn. "These would be a blessing," she admitted. "Lily's growing so quickly." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "There's more in that one." He pointed to another trunk. "Toys, books, such thing." As Eleanor explored the contents of the trunks, Blackwood remained nearby, occasionally commenting on particular items but mostly watching in silence. The toys were simple but charming wooden blocks with painted letters, a small toy train, a set of carved animals that would delight Willie. The books ranged from primers to volumes of fairy tales and adventure stories. "This is generous of you, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, carefully setting aside items that would suit each of her children. "No use letting good things go to waste," he replied with characteristic pragmatism. As Eleanor reached deeper into the trunk of toys, her hand brushed against something soft. She drew out a rag doll similar to the one Blackwood had bought Lily but older. Its fabric face faded from handling, its yarn hair unraveling slightly at one temple. "That's not from the Morgans," Blackwood said quietly, his voice suddenly tight. "Must have gotten mixed in when I was storing things." Eleanor looked up at him, understanding dawning. "It was meant for your daughter." He nodded once, his jaw rigid beneath his beard. "Elizabeth made it while she was waiting. She was always good with her hands." Eleanor held the doll carefully, feeling the weight of its significance. She must have been very happy, preparing for the baby. She was, Blackwood's eyes fixed on the doll, seeing beyond it to memories Eleanor could only imagine. She sewed and knitted for months, had a whole trunk full of little things by the time ... single quotes he trailed off. It must have been unbearable, Eleanor said softly, losing them both at once. There's nothing that prepares a man for that kind of emptiness. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. One day you're building a future, the next you're building a coffin big enough for two. Eleanor rose, still holding the doll. Can put this aside, keep it separate from the other thing. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. No, he said finally. Let Lily have it if she wants it. Elizabeth would have liked that, knowing it brought some child joy. The simple statement, offered in that gruff voice, thick with suppressed emotion, moved Eleanor deeply. Are you certain? Life doesn't stop, Mrs. Hayes. Shouldn't stop. I learned that the hard way. He took a breath, visibly gathering himself. Take whatever will be useful. I'll have Caleb bring it all down later. As they made their way back downstairs, Eleanor sensed a shift between them. A door opened, if only slightly, into the private grief Blackwood carried. She understood something of that grief herself, though James's death, while devastating, had come after years of struggle. The shock of losing both wife and child in one cruel moment. She could scarcely imagine surviving such a blow. At the bottom of the stairs, Blackwood paused. Will you and the children join me for dinner in the main dining room tonight instead of the kitchen? The invitation seemed to surprise him as much as it did Eleanor. Mrs. Gunderson mentioned it might be ... proper. Now that you've settled in, we would be honored, Eleanor replied, wondering at the sudden formality. He nodded, seemingly relieved. 7 o'clock then, he hesitated, then added. And perhaps you might call me John when we're not among the men. Mr. Blackwood makes me feel like my father. The simple request, coming from this reserved man, felt significant in ways Eleanor couldn't fully articulate. If you'll call me Eleanor, she responded. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Eleanor then... As he turned to go, Eleanor found herself watching his retreating figure with new understanding. The gruff rancher who had rescued her family from starvation carried his own burdens, his own losses. Yet somehow he'd found the capacity to extend kindness despite, or perhaps because of his own suffering. She looked down at the rag doll still in her hands, its faded face bearing the stitches of a woman long dead, made with love for a child never born. How strange that it should find its way now to Lily's arms, a bridge between two families shaped by loss, reaching towards something new. The formal dining room at Blackwood Ranch had clearly seen little use in recent years. Eleanor had cleaned it twice since her arrival, dusting the heavy oak table and polishing the silver candlesticks that stood sentinel at its center. But tonight was the first time she'd seen it properly set, crisp white tablecloth, the good china Murs Gunderson kept locked in a cabinet, gleaming silverware laid out with precision. Is this really necessary? Eleanor asked the housekeeper as they made final preparations. The kitchen table has served us well enough. Mrs. Gunderson straightened a fork with military exactness. John doesn't invite people to dine formally, ever. She gave Eleanor a significant look. So yes, it's necessary. Eleanor felt a flutter of nerves as she dressed the children in their best clothes. A Lily in a blue dress found among the Morgan girls' things. William in a small shirt and trousers that Eleanor had altered from the same source. Even Sarah wore a soft white gown that had been tucked away in the attic treasures, her wispy hair combed into a semblance of order. Her own appearance presented a greater challenge. The simple dresses she'd brought from the cabin were serviceable for daily work but hardly suited for a formal dinner. After much deliberation, she chose the least worn of her garments, a dark green wool dress with a lace collar that James had always admired. It was slightly loose now after months of too little food, but the color brought out the honey tones in her hair and warmed her complexion. You look pretty, Mama, Lily said as Eleanor twisted her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Thank you, sweetheart. Eleanor smoothed her daughter's hair, marveling at the transformation a few weeks of proper food and care had wrought. Lily's face had filled out, her eyes bright and clear again. You look beautiful yourself. Is this a special occasion? The little girl asked, clutching the rag doll Blackwood had given her. She had named it Elizabeth, a coincidence that had brought a look of such complicated emotion to Blackwood's face when he'd heard it that Eleanor's heart had ached for him. Just a nice dinner, Eleanor replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself what prompted the sudden formality. When they entered the dining room at precisely 7 o'clock, Eleanor was surprised to find not only Blackwood waiting, but Caleb, Miguel, and Dawson as well. All three ranch hands freshly scrubbed and wearing clean shirts, their hair slicked down with water. They stood awkwardly by their chairs, clearly as unfamiliar with formal dining as Eleanor's children. Blackwood himself presented the most startling transformation. Gone was the work-worn rancher in practical layers. In his place stood a gentleman in a proper suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his usually windswept hair combed into submission. Only his hands, still rough and calloused from daily labor, betrayed the working man beneath the formal attire. Mrs. Hayes, he greeted her, then amended Eleanor. Thank you for joining us. His eyes took in her appearance with quiet appreciation before moving to the children. Miss Lily, you look very fine this evening. And William, quite the young gentleman. William preened at the compliment, standing straighter in his borrowed clothes. Are you a gentleman too, Mr. Blackwood, because of your fancy jacket? A ripple of hastily suppressed amusement passed through the ranch hands. Blackwood's mouth twitched beneath his beard. Just older clothes from a different time, son, he replied, back when I had more occasion to dress for dinner. The meal itself was a triumph of Mears, Gunderson's culinary skills. Despite her splinted leg, she had insisted on preparing the entire dinner herself, grudgingly allowing Eleanor to assist only with the final preparation. Roast beef, potatoes roasted with rosemary, glazed carrots, fresh bread, and for dessert, an apple pie that filled the room with the scent of cinnamon and butter. Conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had expected. Caleb entertained the children with tales of his early days learning to ride, while Miguel spoke of spring calving season soon to come. Even taciturn Dawson contributed stories about the unusual winter weather patterns, predicting an early thaw based on signs only a longtime frontiersman would recognized. Throughout the meal, Eleanor found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Blackwood too. John, she corrected herself silently. He spoke less than the others, but his quiet attention never wavered, especially when the children talked. When Sarah, seated on Eleanor's lap, reached toward him with grasping hand, he took her without hesitation, balancing the infant on his knee while continuing his meal one-handed with practiced ease. You handle her well, Eleanor observed softly while the ranch hands were engaged in a good-natured argument about horse breeding. Most men are awkward with babies. Had practice with my nephews long ago, he replied. My brother's boys. It was the first mention he'd made of any family beyond his lost wife and daughter. You have a brother? Had. The familiar shadow crossed his face. Thomas died at Gettysburg. The war. Of course. What man of his age had escaped its touch? I'm sorry, she said simply. His wife remarried eventually. Good man, raised the boys well. John bounced Sarah gently when she fussed. Haven't seen them in years. There'd be grown men now. Another piece of the puzzle that was John Blackwood slipped into place. More loss. More severed connections. After dinner, while Mrs. Gunderson served coffee to the adults and milk to the children, William tugged at Caleb's sleeve. Can you play the guitar like you do in the bunkhouse, please? Eleanor began to admonish him for the improper request, but Caleb grinned. If Blackwood doesn't mind, I'd be happy to fetch it. To her surprise, John nodded. Been a while since we had music in this house. Might be nice. The guitar Caleb returned with was worn but well cared for, its wood polished from years of handling. The young ranch hand settled into a chair by the fireplace and began to play, his fingers drawing melody from the strings with natural talent. He sang in a clear tenor, old trail songs and ballads that spoke of love and longing, adventure and home. William and Lily sat on the rug before him, enchanted. Sarah had fallen asleep against John's chest, her small body rising and falling with each breath. Eleanor, watching from her chair by the fire, felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in longer than she could remember. He plays well, she commented to John, who sat beside her. Self-taught, says his mother was musical. John's voice was low, meant only for her ears. Boys got natural talent. Eleanor watched the way John's large hand cradled Sarah's tiny back, supporting her even in sleep. You've been very kind to my children, she said, more than I could have hoped. His eyes, storm gray in the firelight, met hers. They make it easy. Good children. All three. They've thrived here, Don single quote. She hesitated, then added, I worry sometimes about that they'll forget their father. That this single quote, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the comfort and security surrounding them, will erase the memory of our life before. John considered this, his expression thoughtful. Children remember love, he said finally, not circumstances. Your husband loved them. That's what will stay. He did love them, Eleanor affirmed. In his way, but she hadn't realized her tone had carried a qualification until he caught it. James was restless, always dreaming of a bigger spread, better fortune. Sometimes I think he loved the dream more than the life we actually had. The words felt disloyal, but they carried a truth she'd rarely admitted even to herself. James had been charming, handsome, full of grand visions, but the daily reality of frontier life had chafed at him. He'd been short-tempered with the children when they interrupted his planning, impatient with the slow progress of their homestead. Dreams have their place, John said, but a man's first duty is to what's real, the people who depend on him. There was no judgment in his tone, only a quiet conviction that spoke of lessons hard learned. Eleanor looked around the room at Lily leaning sleepily against William, at Sarah nestled trustingly against John's chest, at the ranch hands who had welcomed her family without question. I'm grateful for what's real here, she said softly. The evening wound down as the children's eyes grew heavy. Eleanor rose, prepared to carry Sarah up to bed, but John shook his head. I'll help you get them upstairs, he said. No need to wake her. In the quiet hallway outside the children's bedroom. After William and Lily were tucked in and Sarah settled in her cradle, John paused before bidding her goodnight. I have business in town tomorrow, he said. Thought you and the children might like to come along. Get out of the house for a spell. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding. We'd enjoy that. Thank you. He turned to go, then stopped. That shade of green suits you, he said. The compliment offered simply, without flourish. Brings out your eyes. Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Eleanor closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, her hand rising unconsciously to her cheek, which felt warm despite the cool air of the hallway. Such a small thing, that compliment, yet it had been so long since anyone had noticed her as a woman, not merely as a mother or a widow or a housekeeper. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the world in winter stillness. The new moon cast silver light across the snow-covered yard, making the familiar landscape seem magical and unknown. Eleanor stood at the window for a long time, watching the stars prick through the darkness one by one, like possibilities slowly revealing themselves after a long, cold night. Morning brought clear skies and a hint of warmth that suggested winter's iron grip might finally be loosening. Eleanor dressed the children with care for their trip to town, choosing the sturdiest of their new clothes and wrapping Sarah in multiple layers against the lingering chill. She found herself taking extra time with her own appearance as well, brushing her hair until it shone before pinning it neatly beneath her bonnet. "You look mighty fine this morning, Mrs. Hayes," Mrs. Gunderson observed with a knowing glint in her eye as Eleanor entered the kitchen. "Special occasion?" "Just a trip to town," Eleanor replied, busying herself with packing food for the journey. "Fresh air will do the children good." The housekeeper's non-committal hum spoke volumes. "And I suppose John escorting you has nothing to do with that extra ribbon on your collar?" Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "It's merely proper for him to accompany us, as the children's employer." "Employer," Mrs. Gunderson snorted softly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Eleanor could respond, the back door opened and John entered, dressed in his good coat and hat, his beard freshly trimmed. "Wagon's ready whenever you are," he announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the kitchen. "Weather's holding fine." The children's excitement was palpable as John helped them into the wagon, William chattering about the horses while Lily held Sarah securely in her lap. Eleanor sat beside John on the driver's bench, suddenly aware of the picture they must present: a man, a woman, and 3 children, arranged like a family portrait. As they set off, John handed her a thick woolen blanket. "Wrap this around your knees," he instructed. "Air still has a bite despite the sunshine." The simple gesture of care warmed Eleanor more than the blanket itself. She spread it across their laps, the wool brushing against John's leg where it pressed alongside hers on the narrow seat. "Will we see Mr. Abernathy at the store?" Lily asked from behind them. "Likely," John replied. "Got business with him in the bank. Thought you and your mother might want to look at fabric for spring clothes while I attend to it." Eleanor turned to him in surprise. "That's not necessary. Children grow," he interrupted matter of fact, "especially when they're being fed proper. What fits now won't come summer." His practical tone diffused her instinctive protest. She was learning that John preferred to frame generosity as simple common sense, leaving her little room to object on grounds of pride. The road to town seemed different to Dale, less desolate than it had appeared that desperate day when she'd trudged through snow with scissors in her pocket, hunger gnawing at her belly. Today she noticed hints of beauty, the crystalline glint of sunlight on snow, the delicate tracery of bare branches against blue sky, the distant smudge of mountains on the horizon. Or perhaps what had changed was not the landscape, but the woman viewing it. Whisper Creek came into view just as the church bells tolled 10. The small town looked much as it had when they'd left: cluster of wooden buildings, people moving purposefully between them, smoke rising from chimneys. But Eleanor viewed it now through different eyes, no longer as a supplicant, but as someone with purpose and security, if temporary. John guided the wagon to a stop in front of Abernathy's Mercantile. Already Eleanor could see curious faces at windows, townspeople noting their arrival with undisguised interest. News traveled quickly in small communities. Everyone would know by now that the destitute widow Hayes and her children were living at Blackwood Ranch. "Mama, look!" William pointed toward the Mercantile window, where penny candy jars gleamed in colorful rows. "Can we look inside?" "Yes, but stay close," Eleanor cautioned as John helped them down from the wagon. Inside the store, warm air enveloped them, carrying the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Mr. Abernathy looked up from his ledger, surprise registering on his face when he saw Eleanor and her children, so changed from their last visit. "Mrs. Hayes, good to see you and the young ones looking so well." His gaze shifted to John, who followed behind them. "Mr. Blackwood, your order came in yesterday. Got it all set aside." While John discussed business with the storekeeper, Eleanor guided the children to the fabric section. Lily ran her fingers over calico prints with the reverence only a child who had gone without could fully feel, while William discovered a display of wooden toys that held him momentarily transfixed. "That green calico would make a fine dress for spring," a female voice observed. Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, studying her with undisguised curiosity. The woman was known for her charitable works and for knowing every scrap of gossip in 3 counties. "It's lovely," Eleanor agreed politely, "though I haven't decided yet what we need." Mrs. Peterson's gaze traveled from Eleanor to John, who was examining ledgers with Abernathy, then to the children in their new clothes. "I see your circumstances have ... improved considerably since your husband's passing." The implication in her tone was unmistakable. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "Mr. Blackwood has been kind enough to employ me as housekeeper while Emmers Gunderson recovers from her injury. Fortunate for you both." Mrs. Peterson's smile didn't reach her eyes. Such a convenient arrangement. Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah began to fuss in her arms. She bounced the baby gently, grateful for the interruption. "Your little one looks much better," Mrs. Peterson continued, her tone softening slightly as she observed Sarah. "We were all quite worried when we saw you last. Many of us wondered if the child would survive the winter." The reminder of how desperate their situation had been, how visible their suffering had been to the entire town, struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "Yes, she's thriving now," she managed. "Mrs. Hayes." John appeared at her side, his solid presence immediately reassuring. "Found the fabric you were looking for?" "Not yet," Eleanor replied, grateful for his timely arrival. Mrs. Peterson smiled thinly. "Mr. Blackwood, how good of you to take in Miss Hayes and her children. The whole town has been most impressed by your Christian charity. Something dangerous flickered in John's eyes, though his expression remained impassive. Mrs. Hayes's skilled work has been invaluable to my household, he stated flatly. No charity involved. He turned to Eleanor, deliberately excluding the minister's wife from his attention. I've settled accounts with Abernathy. Take whatever time you need to select what you want. As he moved away to help William, who was calling for him to see something, Mrs. Peterson leaned closer to Eleanor. You should be careful, my dear, she murmured. People talk, and a widow with children must be beyond reproach. Mr. Blackwood has a reputation as a solitary man for good reason. I'm not sure what you're implying, Eleanor replied, her voice cooler than the winter air outside. Only that appearances matter, especially for women in your situation. Mrs. Peterson patted her arm condescendingly. The church ladies would be happy to find you more. Appropriate employment in town, perhaps as a seamstress or laundress. The suggestion that she abandon the security and kindness she'd found at Blackwood Ranch for grueling, poorly paid work that would barely feed one child, let alone 3, was so absurd that Eleanor nearly laughed. Instead, she straightened her spine and met the older woman's gaze directly. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Peterson, but my children are healthy and safe, my employment is respectable, and my reputation is my own to safeguard. She shifted Sarah to her other arm. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to select fabric for my daughter's spring dress. The remainder of their visit to town passed without further incident, though Eleanor was acutely aware of curious glances and whispered conversations wherever they went. John seemed oblivious to the attention, focused entirely on his business and on ensuring Eleanor and the children had everything they needed. At the bank, while John spoke with the manager inside, Eleanor waited with the children in the wagon. William had fallen asleep, worn out from excitement, while Lily quietly braided her doll's yarn hair. Mama, the little girl said suddenly, is Mr. Blackwood going to be our new papa? The question, asked with a child's directness, caught Eleanor completely off guard. What makes you ask that, Lily? Mrs. Gunderson told Miguel that Mr. Blackwood looks at you the way Papa used to look at you, before he got sick and angry all the time. Lily concentrated on her doll's hair, not meeting Eleanor's shocked gaze. And you smile more now, like you used to. Eleanor struggled to formulate a response that honored the truth without burdening her daughter with adult complications. Mr. Blackwood has been very kind to us, she said carefully. He's become a friend, but no one will ever replace your papa, I know. Lily looked up finally, her young face solemn. But Papa's gone to heaven, and he's not coming back. And Mr. Blackwood makes William laugh and helps Sarah grow strong and lets me read his books. She paused. And he looks at you like you're something special. Out of the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought, her heart aching with complicated emotion. Before she could respond further, John emerged from the bank and climbed back onto the wagon. The ride home was quieter, the children tired from the excitement of town. As the ranch came into view, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, Eleanor felt a surprising surge of emotion. In just a few short weeks, this place had begun to feel like home in ways her own cabin never quite had. Thank you for today, she said quietly to John as he helped her down from the wagon, the sleeping children already carried inside by Caleb and Miguel, who had come out to greet them. It was good to get away, even briefly. John's hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Noticed Mrs. cornered you, he said, his voice low. She give you trouble? Eleanor hesitated, then decided on honesty, just concern about appearances. A widow living under a bachelor's roof raised his eyebrows apparently. Anger flashed briefly in his eyes. Small minds with nothing better to do than judge what they don't understand. It's the way of things, Eleanor sighed. I learned long ago that a woman alone will always face scrutiny, no matter her choices. John's expression softened. You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. The simple statement, spoken in that gruff voice that had become so familiar, carried a weight of meaning that made her breath catch. Before she could respond, he had turned to unload the packages from the wagon, leaving her to wonder if he had meant the words as they sounded, or if she had heard what her heart wanted to hear. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Lily's question returned to her mind. Was John becoming something more than an employer, more than a friend? And if he was, could she open her heart again after everything she had lost? Eleanor stood at the window, watching stars appear one by one in the deepening blue of twilight. Below in the yard, she could see John's silhouette as he made his evening rounds, checking livestock and buildings before retiring. His movements were purposeful, measured, a man who knew his place in the world and filled it without hesitation. For the first time since James's death, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had expected. Not just survival, but perhaps even happiness again. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside, the first hints of spring whispered through the winter stillness, a promise that even the coldest seasons eventually yield to new life. The fragile warmth that had hinted at spring's approach proved a cruel deception. 3 days after their visit to town, the sky darkened to a sullen gray, and by evening, snow began to fall. Not the gentle flakes of a normal winter storm, but stinging, wind-driven pellets that rattled against the windows like tiny bullets. Late-season blizzard, Mrs. Gunderson pronounced as she hobbled to the window on her crutch, her splinted leg moving more easily now that healing had progressed. Been a few years since we've had one this bad. Eleanor stood beside beside her, watching the swirling white obliterate the barn and corrals. How long will it last? 2, maybe 3 days if we're unlucky. The housekeeper shook her head. Good thing the men got the stock secured this afternoon. John and the ranch hands had worked since dawn to move vulnerable animals to sheltered areas. Anticipating the storm from signs Eleanor couldn't yet read a certain quality to the air. Birds flying low, livestock growing restless. They'd come in only as darkness fell, wind-chapped and exhausted, gulping hot coffee and stew before heading back out for final preparations. Will they be all right out there? Eleanor asked, unable to see anything now beyond the howling white void. John knows what he's doing, Mrs. Gunderson replied. Been through worse. Despite this reassurance, Eleanor found herself pacing the kitchen as the evening lengthened with no sign of the men's return. The children had been settled in bed, initially excited by the storm's drama, but eventually lulled to sleep by its unrelenting roar. When the back door finally burst open, admitting a blast of frigid air and 4 snow-covered figures, Eleanor felt relief wash through her like a physical wave. Lord Almighty, Dawson muttered, stamping snow from his boots. It's turned mean out there. Got the last of the calves into the south barn, Caleb reported, his usually cheerful face drawn with fatigue. Lost sight of the fence line on the way back. Wouldn't have found the house if not for the lights, Miguel added, unwinding a scarf crusted with ice from his face. John entered last, closing the door against the wind's assault. Snow clung to his beard and eyebrows, making him look older, almost ghostly in the lamplight. His gaze found Eleanor's immediately, something unreadable flickering in his eyes at the sight of her waiting. Everyone's accounted for, he said, answering her unspoken question. Animals should be fine until this passes. The men shed their frozen outer layers and gathered around the stove, hands extended toward its warmth. Eleanor moved efficiently, serving hot coffee and reheating stew, while Mrs. Gunderson directed from her chair, unwilling to be sidelined despite her injury. Ropes strung between the house and barn, John told them as he thought enough to speak normally. Anyone needs to check livestock, follow it out and back. No exceptions. Haven't seen a blow this fierce since '68, Dawson commented, cupping his mug with reddened hands. That one trapped the Wilkins family for nearly a week. Found the father frozen not 50 yards from his own door when it cleared. That's enough. Dawson, John interrupted sharply with a meaningful glance toward Eleanor. The older ranch hand looked abashed. Beg pardon, ma'am. Didn't mean to frighten. It's all right, Eleanor assured him, though the image his words had conjured sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. She thought of her own small cabin, its thin walls, inadequate stove. How vulnerable they would have been there against a storm of this magnitude. The children might not have survived. As if reading her thoughts, John spoke quietly. You're safe here, Eleanor. House is solid, firewood's plentiful, food stored for weeks if needed. She nodded, grateful for his reassurance and for the simple fact of their presence here instead of huddled in that distant cabin, fighting for survival once again. After the men had eaten and warmed themselves, Caleb and Miguel headed to the bunkhouse, using the guide rope to navigate the short but treacherous distance. Dawson, as the senior hand, had a small room off the kitchen that served as both bedroom and ranch office. He bid them goodnight and closed his door, leaving Eleanor and John alone in the kitchen, the storm's fury providing a strangely intimate backdrop to the silence between them. You should rest, Eleanor said, noting the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. You've been working since before dawn. In a moment, he remained seated, watching as she moved about, clearing dishes and banking the stove for the night. The children sleep through this racket? Somehow. She smiled faintly. William said it sounds like giants bowling in the sky. Creative boy, John commented, a flicker of amusement warming his expression. He's flourishing here. Eleanor hesitated, then added softly, they all are. Something shifted in John's eyes, a deepening, a decision forming. Eleanor, he began, then stopped as a particularly violent gust rattled the windows. Been meaning to speak with you about something. The serious note in his voice made her pulse quicken. She sat across from him, hands folded on the worn tablecloth. Yes, your cabin, he said, his gaze steady on hers. Have you thought about what you'll do when spring comes? Whether you'll return there? The question caught her off guard, though it had lingered in the back of her mind for weeks. Haven't decided, she admitted. The land is ours. Mine now, but the cabin itself, single quotes she trailed off, remembering its isolation, the struggle to wrest survival from unyielding soil. It would be difficult to manage alone. You could sell, he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. Land has value, even if the structure doesn't. Perhaps. Eleanor studied his face, trying to discern his thoughts behind the measured words. May I ask why you're inquiring now? John's hands, large and weathered, rested on the table between them. For a moment he seemed to be gathering courage, an unusual hesitation for a man typically so direct. Mrs. Gunderson's leg is healing well, he said finally. Doctor says she'll be fully recovered by late spring. Understanding dawned, bringing with it a hollow sensation in the pit of Eleanor's stomach. You're saying my position here will end? No. The force of the single word surprised her. I'm saying your position could change. If you wanted it to. Eleanor's breath caught. What sort of change? John met her gaze directly, something vulnerable now visible beneath his usual reserve. I never planned to marry again after Elizabeth. Thought that part of my life was over, buried with her and our child. The word marry hung in the air between them, electric with possibility. But these past weeks, he continued, his voice lowering, having you and the children here, it's woken something I thought was dead. This house feels like a home again. Eleanor couldn't speak, her throat tight with emotion. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, John said quickly. It's too soon after your loss, I know that, and I'm not the easiest man to live with. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, as Miss Gunderson would readily confirm. John, Eleanor finally managed, her voice barely audible over the storm's howl. Just think on it, he said, rising from the table. Whether you and the children might consider staying permanently as family, not employees. Before she could respond, the kitchen door swung open, and Lily appeared, her face pale in the lamplight. Mama, she said urgently. Sarah's burning hot and making strange sounds. All personal matters forgotten, Eleanor rushed upstairs with John close behind. In the children's bedroom, William sat awake in his bed, watching fearfully as Sarah thrashed in her cradle. Her tiny face flushed scarlet, her breathing labored and wheezy. Eleanor lifted the baby, alarmed at the heat radiating from her small body. She was fine at bedtime, she said, panic rising in her voice. No sign of illness at all. John touched Sarah's forehead, his expression grim. Fever came on fast. Might be the croup. We need to cool her down, Eleanor said, years of mothering experience taking over despite her fear, and something to ease her breathing. John nodded. Mrs. Gunderson keeps medicines in the pantry. I'll wake her. The next hours passed in a blur of worry as they fought to bring Sarah's fever down. Miss Gunderson, roused from sleep, prepared a remedy of honey and herbs while Eleanor bathed the baby in tepid water. John kept the fire stoked and the other children calm, his steady presence an anchor amid the chaos. By dawn, Sarah's fever had broken, her breathing easier though still congested. Eleanor, exhausted beyond words, sat in the rocking chair by the nursery window, cradling her daughter against her chest. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, the world beyond the glass a white nightmare of wind and snow. John entered with a cup of hot tea, his own face drawn from the night's vigil. How is she? Better, Eleanor murmured. Sleeping normally now. He placed a gentle hand on Sarah's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. She's stronger than she looks. She gets that from her mother, a voice observed from the doorway. Mrs. Gunderson stood there, leaning on her crutch, her iron gray hair in an uncharacteristic tangle around her shoulders. Both of you should rest while you can. I'll watch the baby. Eleanor started to protest, but John placed a hand on her. She's right. You're dead on your feet, and Sarah's past the worst of it. Too exhausted to argue. Eleanor carefully transferred the sleeping infant to Mrs. Gunderson's capable arms and allowed John to guide her to the door. In the hallway, he paused, his hand still on her elbow. What I said earlier, he began, his voice low to avoid waking the other children. About you staying. Not now, Eleanor interrupted gently. We're both too tired for such conversations. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Rest, then. We'll talk when the storm passes. But as Eleanor finally lay down in her own bed, sleep eluded her, despite her exhaustion. John's words replayed in her mind, tangled with the night's fear for Sarah. The howling storm, and the memory of a desperate woman with scissors in her pocket, willing to sacrifice her beauty for her children's survival. How far they had come in such a short time, how unexpectedly life had turned. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but within these solid walls, something new was taking shape. Fragile yet, but growing stronger with each passing day, like Sarah recovering in her cradle, like spring waiting beneath the snow. The blizzard raged for 3 days, transforming the landscape into unrecognizable drifts and hollows. When it finally broke, the world emerged renewed, blindingly white under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. The ranch stood like an island in a frozen sea, paths dug through shoulder-high drifts connecting house to outbuild. Sarah recovered fully, her resilient infant spirit bouncing back more quickly than Eleanor would have thought possible. The scare had drawn the household even closer together. Mrs. Gunderson fussing over the baby with uncharacteristic softness, the ranch hands bringing small gifts and silly faces to make her smile. John checking on her multiple times a day with quiet concern. But the conversation interrupted by Sarah's illness remained unfinished. In the week since the storm cleared, Eleanor and John had barely found a moment alone, both of them seemingly hesitant to revisit a subject so momentous. They moved around each other carefully, their interactions marked by a new awareness. Stolen glances and brief touches that spoke of questions still unanswered. Spring announced itself more definitely with each passing day, sickles dripping from the eaves, patches of earth emerging from beneath the snow, a softening in the air that carried the promise of renewal. Eleanor found herself drawn outside more often, watching as the children played in the yard, their cheeks pink with health and happiness. Hard to believe they're the same little ones who arrived here half-starved, Mrs. Gunderson remarked, joining Eleanor on the porch. Quote, the housekeeper had abandoned her crutch for a sturdy cane, her recovery progressing steadily. They've thrived here, Eleanor agreed, watching as William constructed an elaborate snow fort under Miguel's guidance while Lily made Sarah laugh by dangling colorful yarn above her blanket. And you? Mrs. Gunderson asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Have you thrived too? Eleanor considered the question seriously. I've found my footing again, she said finally. Found strength I didn't know I had, and something else besides. I'm thinking. The older woman's tone was knowing but kind. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. John spoke to me during the storm, she admitted, about staying, not as a housekeeper, but as ... single quotes. She couldn't quite bring herself to say the words aloud. About time, Mrs. Gunderson declared with surprising vehemence. I've been watching him circle around it for weeks now. She leaned on her cane, her expression softening. That man's been alone too long. Buried his heart alongside Elizabeth all those years ago. I'm still a widow, Eleanor said softly. It hasn't even been a year since James died. Time's measured differently out here, Mrs. Gunderson replied. By seasons and changes, not by calendar pages. Your James has been gone long enough for grief to soften, for the children to need a father again, for you to need more than memories to keep you warm. The blunt assessment, delivered with the housekeeper's characteristic directness, struck Eleanor as profoundly true. Grief for James remained, but it had transformed from a raw, bleeding wound to a tender scar that would always mark her but no longer define her. I don't know if I can be what he needs, she confessed, voicing her deepest fear. After Elizabeth, after the daughter they lost. Nobody's asking you to replace ghosts, Mrs. Gunderson said firm. John least of all. He's not looking backward, Eleanor. For the first time in years, that man is looking forward. Before Eleanor could respond, William's excited shout drew their attention. John had emerged from the barn leading Domino by the reins. The boy abandoned his snow fort and ran toward them, boots kicking up puffs of snow as he went. Careful, William, Eleanor called instinctively. But John was already lifting the boy onto the horse's back, his strong hands steady on William's small frame as the child beamed with pride. Lily hurried over too, Sarah bundled in her arms, eager to show the baby the horse. Watching them, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, pieces falling into place with a rightness that left her breathless. This moment, her children, John, this place, it wasn't the life she had planned, but perhaps it was the life they were all meant to find. Think on it, Mrs. Gunderson said, patting Eleanor's arm before turning to go inside. But don't think too long. Spring waits for no one. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into night's quiet rhythm, Eleanor found herself drawn to the study where she knew John often worked on ranch accounts before retiring. A lamp burned inside, golden light spilling beneath the closed door. She hesitated, hand raised to knock, suddenly uncertain. Then, gathering her courage, she rapped softly on the wooden panel. Come in, John's deep voice answered. He sat at the desk, ledgers open before him, but his pen was idle in his hand. He looked up as she entered, surprise and something warmer lighting his eyes. Eleanor, he said, rising from his chair. Is everything all right? The children? They're fine, she assured him, while sleeping soundly. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. From this vantage point, she could just make out the distant silhouette of her old cabin, a dark smudge against the silver landscape. I've been thinking, she said finally, her back still to him, about what you said during the storm, about staying. Behind her, she heard him move closer, his footsteps deliberate on the wooden floor. And she turned to face him, finding him closer than she'd expected. Close enough that she could see the flecks of lighter gray in his storm-colored eyes, the silver threading through his dark beard. I need to know why, she said simply. Why me? Why now? John didn't look away, didn't retreat from the directness of her question. Because you walked into Abernathy's store ready to sacrifice something precious for your children, and I recognize that kind of courage. His voice was low, intimate in the lamplit room. Because you rebuilt yourself from nothing, just as I once had to do. Because your children laughed in this house that was silent for too many years. He took a breath, then added more softly, because when I look at you, Eleanor Hayes, I see a future I'd given up hoping for. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. Not Elizabeth, she whispered. I don't want you to be. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and touched a strand of her honey-wheat hair where it fell across her shoulder. I loved her completely. I'll always carry that. But hearts aren't vessels with limited capacity. They expand. You taught me that when I watched you love your 3 children with equal fierceness. Eleanor leaned into his touch, his fingers warm against her cheek. The town will talk, she said, though the thought held less power now than it once had. A smile ghosted across his lips. Let them. We know the truth of what's between us. And what is that truth, John Blackwood? She asked, needing to hear him name it. That I love you, he said simply, the words unadorned but profound in their honesty. That I want to build a life with you and your children. That I want to be a father to them, protect them, see them grow. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, not of sorrow but of a joy so unexpected it almost hurt. I never thought I'd find this again, she admitted. After James died, after we nearly starved, I thought survival was all I could hope for. John's thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. And now I think perhaps happiness isn't just for other people after all. Placed her hand over his where it rested against her face. Yes, John. Yes, we'll stay. His kiss was gentle at first, tentative as if he feared she might break or disappear. But when Eleanor's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, something unleashed in him, years of loneliness and longing transformed into a tenderness so fierce it took her breath away. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, John rested his forehead against hers. I should speak to the children, he said. Ask their blessing properly. Eleanor smiled, touched by his consideration. William already calls you sir with more respect than he ever showed his own father. Lily watches you like you hang the stars. And Sarah ... single quotes, she laughed softly. Sarah practically believes you're her father already. Still, he insisted, they should have a say. Especially Lily. She's old enough to understand what this means. As if summoned by their discussion, a small sound at the doorway made them both turn. Lily stood there in her nightgown, Elizabeth the doll clutched in one arm, her eyes wide as she took in the tableau before her. "Lily," Eleanor said, moving slightly away from John, though he kept his hand at the small of her back. "What are you doing awake, sweetheart?" "I had a dream," the little girl said, her voice small in the quiet room. "About Papa. He was smiling and telling me it was all right to be happy now." Eleanor felt John's hand tighten slightly against her back, heard his sharp intake of breath. She crossed to her daughter, kneeling to look into her solemn young face. "That sounds like a good dream." Lily nodded, her gaze moving from Eleanor to John and back again. "Are you going to marry Emmer Blackwood, Mama? Is he going to be our new papa?" The directness of the question, so characteristic of her eldest, brought a lump to Eleanor's throat. "Would that be all right with you if he was?" Lily considered this with the gravity of her 6 years, then nodded decisively. "Yes, he's kind, and he takes care of us, and he makes you smile again." John crossed the room to kneel beside Eleanor, his presence solid and reassuring. "I'd be honored to be your papa, Lily," he said seriously, "but I would never try to make you forget your real father." "I know," Lily said, with the wisdom of a child who had seen too much too young. "People can have two papas, one in heaven and one here." She looked at her doll, then back at John. "Like Elizabeth has two mamas," the simple statement, connecting John's lost daughter with the doll named for her, struck them both silent with its innocent profundity. Then John gathered Lily into a careful embrace that the child returned without hesitation, her small arms wrapping around his neck with complete trust. Over Lily's shoulder, his eyes met Eleanor's, bright with emotion. In that gaze was a promise of protection, of love, of a future built together from the broken pieces of their pasts. Later that night, after Lily had been tucked back into bed with the reassurance that yes, there would be a proper wedding in the spring, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall freely around her shoulders, and reached for the brush on her dressing table. As she drew it through the long strands, she remembered that desperate day in Abernathy's store. The scissors cold in her hand, the pride that had nearly cost her everything. How strange that her lowest moment had led her here, to this new beginning she could never have imagined. A soft knock at the door announced John's presence. He entered at her invitation, his eyes warming at the sight of her with her hair unbound. "Beautiful," he said simply. Eleanor set down the brush, turning to face the man who had saved her not with charity but with respect, who had offered her children not pity but belonging, who had given her heart not demands but patient understanding. "I almost cut it," she said, running her fingers through the honey wheat waves. "That day in the store, I was so desperate I would have shorn it off without a second thought if it meant feeding my children." John crossed to her, taking her hands in his larger one. "A mother's love," he said quietly, "the most powerful force I know." "And now?" she asked, a hint of mischief entering her smile. "What would you have done if I'd cut it off after all?" "Loved you anyway," he answered without hesitation. "Hair grows back. Courage like yours. That's far rarer and more precious." Eleanor leaned into him then, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Outside, the first trickle of water from melting snow whispered beneath the eaves, a promise of green things soon to come. Winter's grip was loosening at last on the land and on their hearts.